Hello, YouTube. Welcome back to another book review from me, your host, Logan Albright. Today I'm talking about a viewer-submitted book. This is Die Closer to Me. It's the debut novel by David Kuhnlein. David is a viewer of my channel and saw my review of a book called Negative Space by Apocalypse Party Press, which is a press was famous for doing kind of extreme and experimental novels. And this certainly falls into the same category, and he was kind enough to reach out and ask if he could send me a copy of his book and if I would review it, which I am happy to do. His work reminds me a lot of a number of other artists, another number of other authors. I'm reminded of the Illuminatus trilogy. I'm reminded of Neuromancer by William Gibson, and I'm especially reminded of the film works of David Cronenberg, who did Videodrome and The Brood and a number of other films you may have seen, Crimes of the Future being his most recent one. And the reason I'm reminded of Cronenberg is that the novel takes place in this future dystopia, not too distant future dystopia, where all of the world's disabled have been put on a separate planet to kind of live as a colony of disabled people. And there's a lot of sort of body horror elements. There's a lot of deformity. There's a lot of depravity. There's a lot of talk about drug use to kind of cope with the suffering that everyone's going through. There's sort of an obsession with the filth of humanity, the disgustingness of people's bodies and the way that they live and the misery of their lives. It's quite bleak in that sense. But it really delves into that sort of extreme version of humanity. And in that sense, it makes me think of Cronenberg. The plot, which is not, I would say it's not really a plot-driven novel. It's a little bit more of a series of vignettes. It's quite short. It's about 170 pages, and it's broken up into chapters. And each chapter, there's a lot of jumping around and following different characters. So there's not that much of a through-line narrative thread. It's sort of giving you an impression of this world and the people who live in it and what they're going through and what their lives are like. But there is a little bit of a narrative thread. And to the extent that there is one, it follows a character named Jo, who's been living with her mother. She's been taking care of her mother, and her mother dies. And then she goes out into the world and she meets up with this some people who introduce her to this idea of the engineer. And the engineer is sort of a quasi-cult-like religious figure who's interested in these ideas of Eastern mysticism, some kind of a twisted sort of Buddhism, and he's also interested in organ transplants and organ implantation. So those are the kind of things that are going on in this world. It's very dark, it's very gruesome, it can be very graphic at times, but it is also very psychedelic and very hallucinatory as a novel. It really kind of thrusts you into this imaginary world, and you really get a sensory experience of going through it. You know, it's like you're not just reading about it, you really feel what it's like to be in that world. I think the prose can be quite evocative in that sense, and I think the author does a good job of kind of conveying what this is, although I think it's often quite difficult to figure out what's going on in the book because it's not particularly plot driven, and there's a lot of talk that kind of evokes mysticism and that kind of metaphorical language that can be sometimes hard to follow, and the narrative jumps around from different characters so much that it's a little hard to read it as a straightforward story, but as a kind of immersive experience where you're dipped into this world and you're trying to figure out just what life is like there and what's going on. And you have all these, different elements coming together, these different elements of these Eastern religions and the people who are experiencing different kinds of suffering, trying to get on with their lives and deal with it. It's quite interesting. And so I thought I enjoyed the book a bit, and I think I got a lot out of it. I think it's something that I might need to read again to get everything out of it because it can be quite dense in places. It's a little bit hard to follow at times, but it's certainly evocative. It's certainly extreme. It's certainly experimental. And I think if you're into that sort of writing and you like things that are a little bit off the beaten path and a little bit strange and maybe remind you of some of those other authors I mentioned, you might enjoy this book. I believe this is self-published. There's, let's see if I can find out here. It says under license to Marigold Independent Press. So I'm not sure about Marigold Independent Press, if that's an actual press or if it's self-published, but it is available to purchase if you like it. And I thought it was worth reading, and I thought it was quite interesting, and it's very different than most of the other commercial fiction that you will come across these days. So a big thank you to David Kuhnlein for sending his book. I enjoyed reading it. It's always interesting to see independent authors getting some attention, and I like to help out if I can, because, you know, it's a difficult world out there for independent authors. It's hard to get people to notice you. The noise of all the other media that people have to have access to, can make it really hard to get noticed. And so I'm grateful for David for being a viewer and for sending me his book so that I can highlight it for all you people. And if you're interested, Die Closer to Me by David Kuhnlein is certainly worth the read. That's all I've got for today. Thanks so much for watching. I've been your host, Logan Albright, and I will catch you next time.